This video is about how the Old Suffolk and East Anglian way of speaking ended up influencing the way that Australians speak today. And this dates back hundreds of years, and I will explain some of the reasons why and when people from Suffolk and East Anglia went over to Australia and how the influence of how they speak was connected to us and our old way of speaking here. First of all, there was the convict transportation era, and that went from 1788 to the 1840s. That's when a lot of convicts were sent from here in Suffolk and East Anglia and other places. They were sent to New South Wales, so that a colony of convicts were transported a long way. And the thing is, when we talk about convicts, you've got to remember that in those times, a lot of people had very harsh sentences put on their crimes which were often very simple, like for example poaching. If you were hungry and you were trying to feed your family and you poached a rabbit, the consequence of that could be that you would be sent to Australia for your crime. And even down to picking up sticks and branches on private land that you might want to use to keep your house warm and keep your family warm, that was also an offence back then. So when people talk about the convicts that went to Australia, yes, some of them had committed some very terrible crimes, but a lot of those people were also convicted of crimes which they committed simply because they were either very hungry or they were trying to keep warm. It was bad back then, and there was things in place like the Enclosure Act, where public land, which these people once worked on, farmed on, gathered their food from, or their firewood, it all became private land. So what were these people to do to try and survive? And some of them, sadly, were convicted of these crimes, and that's how they ended up in New South Wales in Australia. And it's those early influences of our old way of speaking that went over to Australia, that amongst all the people that were from, example, Suffolk and from East Anglia, that's how those areas ended up speaking predominantly Old Suffolk back then. Another reason why we went over to Australia was what was known as the Assisted Migration Program, and that was something which happened after the Napoleonic Wars. It was from 1815 to the 1870s, and it was a settler program. And because during that time here in Suffolk and East Anglia, there were a lot of people that in these rural areas were very poor, they were very hungry, it was difficult to find work after the war, and so this program was set in place, and sometimes it had a religious context to it as well, but there was these settler programs that were initiated so that people could go over to Australia and start again, and they would find work and they would have a better life. So rather than going through a period of time here where they were out of work and very hungry and their families were very much feeling the effects of this, they went over to Australia to start a new life. And once again, during that early era, the accent and the dialect went over there with them. So as their families started to grow and the areas started to grow over in Australia, there was this hint of Suffolk dialect and the Suffolk way of speaking being taken over there that would have filtered through into what is really recognised now as Australian. During the 1870s to the 1900s, it's what's known as the 19th century train migration. And this chain migration was families that had settled into places like Victoria and New South Wales and others. They were allowed to invite their families over. So if they were having a better life over in Australia, then they were allowed to invite more of their family members over. So that is another reason why more Suffolk and East Anglia people went over to Australia and once again took our way of speaking with them. So even though Australia has got its own identity and its own way of speaking, which you can hear similarities, but Australian has got its own lovely distinct dialect and its own accent and their own way of speaking, then you can understand how there were influences of the old Suffolk going over there for hundreds of years. And this is why quite often when Suffolk people are in different places, or sometimes when we're in our own county, sometimes we get asked if we're Australian, and that's because people are more familiar with the Australian accent than they are with the old Suffolk one, which is dying out. So our little influence from Suffolk going over to Australia has become a lovely Australian accent and dialect in its own right, and it's an accent that I personally love. But there's many reasons as to why there's just those little hints of Suffolk in it that people often hear and pick up on. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.